It is May 16th, and it is our Monday. Love what you do again. As always, we are here about helping leaders own their leadership, making sure they are accurately reviewing and clarifying their evidence so that they truly walk their talk and they love what they do again, or love it even greater. And we've been talking about the concept of scientific definitions and measurements and assets and biases and all kinds of fun stuff. And we did an introduction last week into assets and biases, and we're going to go over that again, as well as add a definition. And Haley, is there anything you want to set us up with in regards to that?
Not yet. Maybe after.
I appreciate that. So the gift of Haley doing some amazing visuals is, let us remind you, as Steve shared with us last week, this is the beautiful Hemi that is sitting on here. I happen to have one in my vehicle, which is quite a asset when you get onto a Texas freeway. But anyway, right? So those of you who have not driven on Texas freeways, it is a unique perspective compared to a California freeway. So the Hemi asset is a perspective with a score of 100%. These are perspectives that are ways of thinking from which you have a very high capacity for clarity, wisdom, good value judgment. Cognitive assets are your good ways of thinking, and there's never a time or circumstance when good thinking is a bad thing. Notice that there are key good words in there. It's going to be purposeful for our definition we're adding today. Next definition. This is our gel cells, the cognitive biases and liabilities. Stephen, you want to read that one for us?
A perspective with a score of less than 100% is a cognitive bias. These ways of thinking have some form of learned or adopted bias. A cognitive bias is not necessarily all bad. Your biases have, at times, helped you in life, but they can also create problems. When a cognitive bias undermines your success and happiness, it is considered a cognitive liability.
So true. And key point on this one, Haley, before we move forward, is it says it's not necessarily all bad. Your biases have at times helped you. So a lot of times, a lot of people, when they look at their biases, they don't recognize that they are things that they've learned how to use. Doesn't mean it's the best way of using their thought patterns. It means that they've learned how to adapt to it and function in it. And more often than not, people don't realize that we spend almost up to 85% of our time in these biases, and yet they can be self-sabotaging ourselves. So I just want to make sure we clarify that as that it can be considered a cognitive liability. Okay.
April, before we move on,
Sure.
does it become a cognitive liability after like a certain degree of bias, like the bias becomes so bad that now it's a liability, or how, like, when does that shift happen?
So the joyful awareness of the depth of Axiogenics and Robert Hartman value profile is that there is an immense amount of research to this material. So the one thing that Axiogenics will teach when you go through the coaching certification process is that anything under 100% is a cognitive liability. Anything, doesn't matter if it's 10%, 25%, 85%, 92 or 99, it is still a cognitive liability. And it can be a shift in a story, it can be a shift in experience, it could be, and I've had that happen even in my own assessment, where I had an asset that moved into a liability. And what happens in that case is there's usually experiences or stories that are happening in our life that are impacting that asset. And so can assets change? Absolutely. Can liabilities change? I've had liabilities that become assets. As we grow and mature, our life will change. So the way we value things will change. So the assets and liabilities do have moments of shifting. Usually our highest asset doesn't usually shift, and our highest liability doesn't usually shift, is my understanding. I'm still learning all the depths of it, because there's 6 trillion different, if not 6 billion or whatever the word is, for different forms of the measurements. Does that help answer that question?
I think I was asking, since this slide is all about the cognitive biases, and it says when your bias undermines your success and happiness, it is considered a cognitive liability. So it sounds like biases and liabilities are connected, but not the same.
Well, so I appreciate the specific definition. So a liability is just like on a accounting spreadsheet, right? An asset is something that you're adding as a credit. A liability is something that's an expense. So a liability is taken away. Does that make sense? So a bias is something that's distracting, sabotaging, or impacting our way, a roadblock, if you will. So yes, in that aspect of that definition, they are connected.
Okay. Thank
That
you.
help?
Yes.
Thank you for asking. Great clarity in the, and undermine is a very powerful word, right? Although it may function, doesn't mean it's the highest way of functioning. Does that make sense?
Right. And it probably imparts a certain level of duress on your daily living. And it's when that pressure, that duress becomes unmanageable, that it takes away from your quality of life. Even though you may be able to operate in that at that level.
Right.
In my case, it would probably be my wife that would let me know that I'm operating too deeply in that level and to get out, so I can be human again. Yeah.
Well, and the gift that she gives you is she knows you well enough to see certain triggers and responses that she has the permission to make commentary about, right? And I just did a podcast interview today, and we talked all about thought patterns and how we respond to certain situations. And sometimes when we're responding in a bias or an asset, it will show in the actions and how we live it out. Does that make sense? Does that help? Haley, you have another thought?
No.
Okay, we'll keep on trucking. We introduced this, and we have, this is one of the visuals from our Living Unlayered experience. So we've incorporated the Axiogenics and the self-leadership program to help people start learning how they use their A game and their B game and apply it to every part of their life so that they can start removing some of the jail cells out of their life. So we use this visual as ideally when we're using more of our assets, we have more of a productive, fruitful, and joyful life. And yet some of the roots still have to be addressed. If you notice there's some red and oranges and yellows, you'll see those in a couple different reports we use. Yet with the awareness of how the mind works, we want to work on our mindfulness and learn how to build the muscle to start developing our asset. And there's a really simple way to do that. Go ahead and go to the next one. Final thought in regards to some of the depths of this, and then we'll start giving some other visuals, is we introduced last week, over 40% greater productivity and cooperation happens when we move into our assets. We have more energy and more connection. And this truly is a scientific fact because there is an intrinsic, extrinsic, and systemic measurement that all these, we don't go into the math every time we do these strategies. It is not something that the consumer needs to know. There is a ridiculous amount of math behind the scenes though. The bias is kind of like a broken oar in your boat. It'll still function. Like I said, your biases will still get you to where you want to go and you've learned how to get there. Doesn't mean that it's as simple as it could be or as joyful as it could be. You could instead go into the next visual, which is the Hemi on the boat, and it moves. I love that she created the graphic to move too. Isn't that exciting? It functions at a much higher pace and a much more, as I completed the interview on the podcast today, the gentleman said, that was absolutely effortless. I said, yay. I love when I hear the word effortless because we have operated in where we're supposed to operate in. And so with that, we're going to go into one more slide. Oh, I forgot that one was on there too, Miss Haley.
Get past it because we did it last week. So we
yes, thank you. So we did, we introduced the document. We don't hand that document out unless you're in the self-leadership program because there is, or doing the introduction with us because we do need to do some groundwork and foundation with you for that process. So when you look at the videos for either one, that is just an awareness of a tool. So, Miss Haley, I know you love this definition. Would you like to share this out loud, please?
Sure. This is the definition of good. Something is good to the degree that it has every attribute required to fulfill its purpose.
And Haley, any specific words stand out for you for that?
Yeah, they're in capital letters. Good, attribute, and purpose.
There's a reason they're in
Right.
capitals, right? And the good, we mentioned a couple of times in the asset, right? And then we also, the attributes are keywords, and obviously the purpose, which is going to set us up for our next presentation on June, goodness, 6th, I believe, is our next scheduled Q&A. So, Stephen, a question about this definition before I make a couple comments about it.
I've written it down several times when we have talked about it. It's all encompassing. It's could be possibly the perfect definition. The way it's set up, something is good to the degree that every attribute required to fulfill its purpose is there. And I mean, what else could you ask for?
Right.
Yeah. You're always asking, when you're in front of people, you want everyone to arrive. You want everyone to be there and be present. Everything to be there that's required for the message to be the best message that it can be. So it's a perfect definition.
Well, and there are multiple depths to this definition. So when something is good to degree, and I don't know if there's a to the degree.
To the degree. Yes, it's supposed to be to the degree. Sorry.
I was like, oh, did I miss one? The gift of understanding. So if I have a vehicle that's a fuel-based vehicle, if it's missing fuel, is it still a good vehicle?
Yeah.
It's still a good vehicle if it doesn't need to move.
Right.
If you need it to fulfill its purpose to move you from point A to point B, then it would need a certain amount of fuel to get us there, unless it had it has a hybrid and also had the ability to be electrically charged. Right? That's a whole nother conversation. But the opportunity is that is a external tool. The people inside the vehicle that it functions from point A to B is an intrinsic, and the purpose is fulfilling of where they're going or whatever it may be. There's a multitude of depths to the definition of the good and the purpose. Is everybody following that example?
I like the example. I like the motor and the car getting you someplace, but rather than fuel, you can have fuel, but if you don't have oil to lubricate it or coolant to cool it and keep it cool, then you don't have every attribute required to fulfill the purpose. So even though you have fuel, you may be missing something else. So you have to make sure you have everything.
Or wheels. If you don't have wheels.
Or wheels. Or tires with air in them.
Right. Or brakes that stop you if you need to stop, right?
You'll never need to stop.
Yeah, right. The opportunity, a vision came up. I remember having a real estate client that their son literally had a vehicle that was powered on vegetable oil.
Yeah.
And there are all different types of fuel, if you will. If we were to use a vehicle, there are all different pathways for individuals. So as we're moving into the concept of purpose, and this is where I'll leave it for today, is that each of us, one of the questions that my coach, who you met, Peter, said, every time we are thinking about our purpose or a purpose we're looking to achieve, we have an opportunity to ask ourselves, is what we're doing today giving us the ability to fulfill every attribute? So in our Q&A, let's use that as an example. Do we have a message prepared? Do we have a visual prepared? Haley did an amazing job with the visuals, always. So we had an attribute. We have people which we get to have a conversation with about it. We have another attribute. The level of the clarity, pretty simple definition. How people perceive it and what they do with it, even for the people joining us now, the people joining us as we move forward, they get to choose Oh, there's Mr. Rep. We were just talking about Mr. Rep and his Hemi. We have two Steves in the room. Each person listens to this message, they get to decide how the attributes are connected to their purpose. Did I plant a seed with that? Okay, and Steve, are you able to hear us okay? Yes, okay. He's muted, so we won't, when you're ready, you holler. Haley, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I love this definition. There are a couple things that I think about with this. The first one is the next slide. I have the central question with the greatest net value on it. I'll go there right now, actually. So this is the question that it all comes back to this question, right? And the slides previous before is talking about we're working towards goodness, we're working towards something being good, therefore creating the greatest net value. Those are not subjective things. Those are objective things that we're working towards. So I love that definition, because there are, just from the layman's understanding of the word good, am I talking morally good? Am I talking good as the definition that we've seen? It has every attribute required to fulfill its purpose. So if I was trying to move towards moral goodness with all of this, I would get lost in my own opinions and my own perspectives. But if I'm able to move toward that definition of goodness, that this thing has every attribute required to fill its purpose, then I can objectively look at all of these and I can objectively decide what's the greatest net value. So then that's the second thing that I think about after I thought about that is the creation story. When God, every day after everything that he created, he said, and it was good.
Good.
And I would always wonder, but it wasn't though. Because something bad happened. But now it makes sense, because it was good in the sense that it had every attribute required to fill its purpose, which was he wanted to create a space for us. And he did. So those are the two things that kind of tie together with that definition for me. And it just helps me to actually digest this stuff, because it's consistent with what we're working toward.
Mm-hmm. There's so much you said there, Haley. I am going to come back to that in just a minute, but Stephen, you had a thought.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, you're like, neither one of you touching that. Mr. Rep's like, what did I come into, right? So we recorded the first part of it, Mr. To remind you where we were last week, Mr. Rep, and then we added one more definition. So Haley, will you go back to that definition for just a minute, then I'm going to come back to this one and pinpoint a couple of things you said. So first of all, something is good to the degree that it has every attribute required to fulfill its purpose. So we introduced the assets and the biases. So when we're looking to use our asset, that is the good, that is and the central question is one of the tools to help fuel that asset. When you go through the value proposition or the VQ process, and you go through the self-leadership program, it gives you all the assets and biases and tools to start developing the mindfulness for that. With that, and it helps you start learning how to pull that good in the assets and give you some questions to ask yourself to draw out that asset. And more often than not, we think that our asset we're in 100% of the time. We're only in our asset 5 to 15% of the time at most. And so it's an awareness of understanding that we want to understand what attributes are required to fulfill the purpose. So then you moved into the central question, which is the next one, please. And this is a powerful question that is worth as often as possible you can remember. And remember that Peter introduced when he was our special guest, he said, we want to introduce the titanium rule. And that is to think value-genically. So Haley, if you were to define value-genically, could you define that?
I don't know if it would be like, totally in line with any of the material, but it would be centered around the asset or centered around the greatest net value.
Mm-hmm. It would ultimately be creating that greatest net value and making a choice and an action action that is aligned with creating the greatest net value. So when we're operating from the asset, we're operating from that greatest net value. When we're operating in biases, more often than not, we're operating in a undermine. Remember that word, the undermine? So something to think about, and I love the visual you put here when you've got the ways out there, right? So when you brought up the creation story and you're like, well, it wasn't good. And I loved how you said that. It really impacted you and you could see it. It wasn't good. It went, oh, wait, it was good. We screwed it up, right?
Yeah. Right.
It wasn't anything that
Right.
was done in the creation part of it. It was a human choice.
Right. And I think valuegenic, the word, if you genic, genesis, the creation. So you're creating value. That's what valuegenic would mean to me.
The simplest form of the word, yes.
Right.
We are going to ask Peter to purposely define that, and we will include that in our future conversations because, and the more I introduce that concept, because I was everybody's heard of the golden rule, which is to treat others how you want to be treated. There's a platinum rule that says treat others as they want to be treated. And that's where Peter and I went back and forth on, no, let's go to think valuegenically with the titanium rule, which is the highest metal, I believe, correct, Haley?
It's stronger than platinum.
So
Yeah.
the gift is to when everyone is creating. So let's give you one more definition in the net value, and it's a paraphrase definition. The concept of net value is that I'm thinking of myself and others, short and long term, of how the impact of my choice is going to ultimately create greater net value. Does that make sense? There's a little bit more to that definition. Did I, anything you want to add, Ms. Haley?
Not yet. I don't think so.
Steve Rep, did we catch you up quick enough? Or is there any other questions you have?
No, you've been great. I'm with you.
Awesome.
Go ahead, Don.
So a valuegenic mindset includes all things considered, the pros and cons for all people concerned, yourself and others, both short and long term. That is the definition of a net value. So did we cover a whole lot in that central question and the definition of good and how we can operate from what our good is? It's a lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
So how is it defined with how we're going to move forward in purpose? And did you put any other slides on here, Haley?
No, it's just this.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you for all of that. And actually, Haley, will you go back one more time to the definition of good, please?
Sure.
And I just want to keep this on the screen one more time. So, Mr. DeSena, if you were to contemplate a purpose off the top of your head, would you have one?
Yeah.
One you'd like to share?
No. A predictable, steady flow of income month to month.
Love that. Perfect purpose, right? And ultimately, not only does that provide a net value, that provides a net value to your family, to yourself, and to your community. Would you agree?
I agree. Yes.
Awesome. So how do you verify that? To what degree do you have every attribute required to fulfill that purpose?
To what degree do I have every attribute? To the degree that I'm willing to bring those attributes to the table.
I love that awareness. So if you were to contemplate that just a little bit in a day, let's just say in the next 24 hours.
So I need to reside where I have the most strengths. And that appears to be in a room talking with groups of people. So I need to surround myself with people and engage people in conversations that are purposeful towards reaching that end.
And yesterday evening, did you have a group of people?
I did.
And were you being the joyful, present Stephen you are?
Yes, there was a lot of family and friends but yes, and it was more of I would say a touch opportunity than a ask for business opportunity.
So what you were doing was investing in a relationship,
Absolutely.
multiple relationships at once.
Yep.
And it all, right? And so was it a good experience?
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. It's a blast.
It was a blast. Did it fulfill its purpose?
Yes, it did.
The same way in each of our purposes, we get to look at them and say, what attributes are required? And do we have every attribute required? So in the predictive flow of income, we know statistically that we have some habits that are required on a consistent basis.
Yes.
And those thought patterns operating from our attributes with consistency create and fulfill the purpose.
Yes.
I appreciate you thinking about that. Stephen, Mr. Rep, are you following all that?
Yeah, I am. I don't have an example of my own right now that would be considered good because it would not provide any net value for either you guys or me.
I appreciate your candor. You were thinking that through, I could tell. I appreciate that. Haley, would you like to choose an example before we pull down that definition?
An example of a purpose?
Mhm.
Yeah, being a good friend.
Love that. Okay. And how do you determine if you have every attribute required?
First I have to determine what makes a good friend. And then I have
Excellent.
to see if I have those things.
Yeah. There's a whole lot of definition there, right?
Right.
And it was so interesting because there's actually a study. We did some research to update in the book. And actually I had a conversation with a couple of people about this lately. And I don't know if you all know that you only can have 2 to 3 people in your inner core circle. In most cases, you have 2 or 3 people that are in the intimate core. And then it goes out to up to 10. And you've heard more often than not. And by the way, we did all the statistical research on it. You'll hear, and the definition is consider the 5 people you surround yourself with, and you'll look at where your net value is, what your thought patterns are, who you associate with, etc. And then it goes even further out, and at most we can have up to 150 so-called acquaintances that we see or pass across, etc. And
That's a lot of work.
it's immense, right?
150.
Well, and those of us that have, 1,500 people in some of our social media profiles, is there a reality that we've touched every one of those people? It's possible in some form or fashion, but not usually all at the same time. Does that make sense?
Sure.
More often than not, we touch, and so I believe in the concept of one hand up and one hand down. One hand up, meaning moving 5 people up and making sure that 5 people are moving me up. Does that make sense? So, and depending on, sometimes it's more. It depends on what territory. So Haley, I love the friend concept. Is some of your friends, you may only be a touch once a quarter. Some of your friends you may talk to on text every day, or on the phone, or in person, whatever that friend relationship is, and how you define, just like with Stephen, he said, well, some of these people are family and friends, and those were relationships we were investing in. Some of them are business relationships and friends, right? Everybody's got that different. I love the definition concept of defining what is that good friend first.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do I want to invest in that? And what attributes are then required to be good to me and good to them to create the greatest net value?
Right. And that's an interesting concept too, because I think initially that kind of requires an agreement from 2 people to determine, okay, what is good in this friendship? Because I have friends that I talk to weekly, but I also have friends that I haven't seen in years, and it would be odd if I tried to talk to them weekly. So, but they would say I'm a good friend to them, though we haven't talked often, because that's our agreement. It may be unspoken, but we're just okay with the fact that we kind of exist parallel, you know, and I have other friends who would be hurt if I didn't reach out to them that often. So my responsibility doesn't necessarily, you know, they don't have anything to do with my responsibility in the moment to be a good friend, but they do have a say in what those attributes are that are going to make that a good friendship. So the other side has to be receptive, you know, to what the other person is asking, or else it doesn't actually have every attribute required, and it's not good.
Exactly. And one of those key attributes in any relationship is trust. So one of the things you talked about is, and I have a beautiful girlfriend and a family member that I could see them tomorrow, and I may have not seen them for 10 or 20 years, and it'd be like we just saw each other yesterday.
Right.
Because there's a level of depth to the relationship that other relationships don't have. And yet most often that's not created overnight. So love the purpose that you brought up and the clarity that you helped a lot of people with in the clarity of what attributes are. So trust would be one of those attributes, right? Agreement would be an attribute. Communication would be another attribute. Do you see where we're going? So now we can see why we are aligning to start having a conversation about how we define our purposes on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, and then year-to-year basis. And that's what we'll dive into in our next session. So thank you for bringing that back up again. Open time for questions now. Any question you like. This is where you get to decide if you want to come out of net value for a minute, Mr. Rep.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I have no questions. I'm in an airport and it's loud, and I'm just appreciating the input again from you guys. And I'm definitely going to put some thought into what I've been hearing and the direction I can see you guys go.
Love it. And an airport, where are you headed?
I'm in Denver heading back to Medford, and then I still have to drive back to the coast tonight. So it's been a long day.
Wow.
So, well, we're thankful that you joined us in the midst of it. So I'm sure
Appreciate
that's Denver airport is a blast in itself. So that's an understatement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can tell. All right. So no questions, but thank you for being here. Mr. DeSena, any
Thank you.
questions?
I have no questions today. I am filled, my head's spinning with definitions of good.
Well, and the exciting thing is that we get to, and Stephen, you're already in part of the Axiogenics process. So you're learning you're beginning the stages of this mindfulness.
Mhm.
Goes Haley. You're actually a little further along in it. And yet, Haley, it takes, I mean, even though you somewhat think like this now, and I think this would be a great thing to wrap up on. And we had a conversation about how easily our residue is there. And is there anything you'd like to add about that?
Well, first, so if you don't know what we mean by residue, and I just like learned this word, so maybe you know, we could clarify my understanding, but I think it's, you know, these are things that you used to operate in your bias in, and you've learned that it's a bias. And so you've learned how to replace that with your asset, but there's still some residue of that bias there. Is that right? Okay. So
Yes.
with me, I think I mean, there's always going to be residue for all of us. And like for me personally, I feel like I have more residue than everyone. Everyone probably feels that way, you know, because you're hyper aware of, especially after going through this program, you're hyper aware of how you're thinking and why you're thinking that way. And, you know, oh, that was my bias. I shouldn't have done that. So that's inevitable. I think that's important to say.
Right.
But also it's not something that should discourage you or stop you. And I think maybe the thing I want to say is just knowing that it's there is sometimes enough. And don't allow it to discourage you, because you are going to become hyper aware of your biases. You are going to start noticing, you're going to start being able to take true accountability and take a true account of what really happened, because all of these things are going to be suggested. Maybe you were operating this way. Maybe you were coming from this perspective. And sometimes those perspectives are not good. They were very selfish. So it hurts and it's hard to come to grips with that accountability. But there's a replacement and there's a reason. And like we were talking about before, sometimes those biases served you well, and you might continue to be able to use them to serve you well. It's just another tool that you'll have, and it's another thing that you can use to kind of, improve and change your unhappiness, because that's inevitably going to be there if you're in your biases all the time. Yeah, I don't know if that was at all what you were asking, but
Mr. Steven, I know you said you have to pop off short. Is there something you wanted to add?
That just raises a question. Is so if you at some point in this journey, is it accurate to say that your biases could be used in a time when you needed them and be beneficial to the purpose?
Well, they create awareness. So as Haley is talking about, the more aware you choose to become, the more aware you're going to recognize when you use the bias and how you've learned to adapt it. And you get to decide. Nobody gets to decide for you. You get to decide, is the attributes there required to fulfill the purpose? More often than not, it will not usually be attached to a bias. It's just part of your toolkit.
so
Okay,
if
so
I can use an example.
At that point, does it become part of the needed assets for the definition of good?
Go ahead, Haley, you have a comment.
I would just like to make an example. So like one of my biases is appreciating my assets, basically. So that means I know that it's there. I know I'm good at it, but I don't always have the confidence, or I don't always think that it's the best decision for me to operate in that way, to speak up, to change something. That's a bias of mine. Sometimes that's a good thing, because sometimes it is appropriate for me to step back and allow someone else to make the decision or to be the driver. Sometimes that's appropriate. So really, me learning about my bias is not about me squashing that thing inside of me. It's about learning, when does this serve me and move me toward my greatest net value? And when is this causing me to, when am I being undermined by this bias? So it's not necessarily that I have to stop doing that. I don't know that I ever could. It's who I am. It's how I operate. It's how I've learned my whole life to be. But I can start to learn the triggers to recognize, this is not going to serve me right now, or it will serve me right now, either way. And if I think it's not going to serve me, then that's when my asset can come in and I say, okay, I'm operating in my bias right now. What can I replace that with? What mindset can I replace that with? And then it's just a plug and play, I would say.
I love the plug and play. It really is a tool to develop the awareness and thought pattern, right? We can introduce you to the thought patterns, yet until you build the muscle, it's like somebody that attempts to run a 26-mile marathon. If they didn't practice and build up their muscles to run the first 5 or whatever they're going to do, the 26 may not ever happen. It's a commitment and a choice. Does that make sense? It's learning how to use the muscles. And all we're doing is introducing people to definitions, thought patterns, and purposes so that we can ultimately move them forward in their thought patterns. Make sense? Nice and simple. All right, everyone, we're going to give you more time to your day. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a safe flight.
Safe flight, yes. Bye, sir.